So thank you very much for coming. I normally don't use PowerPoints, but today I do because of this one quotation from Marx's Capital. That quotation will both shape today's lecture and the two lectures that follow, the one tomorrow on political form, i.e. the form of the state, and the one on Wednesday on legal form, i.e. the form of law. It's difficult in Marx to find, is my English okay? Am I loud enough? Not too fast? I have water here, I've got a terrible cough sitting in my throat. It's quite difficult to find in Marx a statement of one sort or another about his, in inverted commas, method. The one thing that one can find is this quotation. The quotation says, it is much easier to find in reality, as it were, or to look at reality backwards into time, to see reality as a sort of unfolding of something that is presumed or is presupposed to be eternal. And therefore to see the existing society as an historically, and I now use an Althusserian term, an historically overdetermined manifestation of general historical laws. That's the easiest thing he says in the first part of the quotation. It is in reality much easier to discover by analysis the earthly core of the mystic creations of religion. And I just explained what that might be. Then to do the opposite, he says. And the opposite is what he himself understands to be the thing to do, the method of critique. It's much more difficult to do the opposite, and that is to develop from the actual given relations of life the forms in which they have become apotheosized. Apotheosized could mean something in which they appear as divine, or in which they appear as natural, in which they appear as ontological, in which they appear as transhistorically valid. So as to develop from the actual relations of life, the forms in which they have become, let's use a different word, reified. The latter method, the one that says to develop from the actual relations of life, the forms of human existence. That latter method, he says, is the only materialist one, and therefore the only scientific one. So the materialist method, he seems to say here, is not to look into history, to see, as it were, an objective logic unfolding, which explains the contemporary predicament of a particular mode of production. No, he says. The materialist method is to develop from the actual relations, from the existing relation, from the capitalist relations, or from the bourgeois social relations, the form in which they have become apotheosized. The weakness, he says, of the former method, the weakness that is the weakness of an approach which tries to discover by analysis, the common core of the mystic creations of religions, or the common core of the naturalness of the economic categories. The weakness, he says, of the abstract materialism, so he calls that abstract materialism. And he likens that abstract materialism to the natural sciences. He says, the weakness, I'm quoting again, of the abstract materialism of natural science, a materialism which excludes the historical process, are immediately evident from the abstract and ideological conceptions expressed by its spokesmen and spokeswomen whenever they venture beyond the bounds of their speciality. So he calls the method that is usually associated with Marxism as abstract. He calls it uncritical. He calls it a method which excludes history or the historical process. The quotation says that historically specific social forms, like the forms of value, forms of state, the forms of wealth, the forms of labor, the forms of law, and one might wish to include also or add the forms of culture, are, he says, as far as this quotation is concerned, the historically specific mode of appearances, or the historically specific modes of existence, of specific and definite social relations. So it's not, as it were, as it's commonly held, that the capitalist mode of production is an historically overdetermined mode of historically active, transhistorical laws of development. He rejects that, as far as that quotation is concerned, as an abstract materialism that excludes the historical process. He says the opposite, and the opposite is that these mystifying forms, the economic forms, the political forms, the legal forms, have to be understood as forms of historically specific social relations. So what are we criticizing when we're criticizing the economic forms? How do you criticize money? How do you criticize value? How do you criticize the state? Is our critique moralizing, which says, this is how it is. It ought to be different. And it can be different. There's a promise here in our society, a promise of freedom, a promise of equality. Or are these normative norms, these normative forms, these normative ways of expressing this is, in fact, implicated by the very society that they express in terms of its freedom, in terms of its equality? Or are these norms transhistorically valid? So what do we criticize? Is the critique of political economy, therefore, a moralizing critique? Or is it a constructive critique which says, here are the economic categories. Here is our economic form of existence. And here is my critique. And my critique is that what exists needs to be perfected, needs to be rationalized, needs to be organized better, beyond exploitation, beyond domination. If we say that and are constructive in as far as the economic categories are concerned, our critique here would again criticize their capitalist mode. It would criticize their capitalist mode with a view of making these same categories work better, particularly for the sake of workers, in a rationalized, in a perfected labor economy, which used to be called socialism. Again, would we thereby not, as it were, consider the capitalist economic categories as transhistorically valid in terms of their generic properties and criticize only their capitalist instantiation. Yeah, as far as the quote is concerned, we're making our lives easy. Our lives is a sort of a life, or a thinking, is a thinking of an abstract materialism, which excludes the historical process, which does not, in fact, try to understand the economic forms as forms of definite social relations. So is Marx's dialectics a dialectics of society and history? A critique which understands society as an historically specific modality, an historically specific mode of transhistorical processes, which is rejected by that quotation? Or is it a negative social critique, which looks at these economic categories and says these cannot be critiqued on their own basis, because the understanding of these categories depends on us comprehending the social relations that they manifest as the apostatized forms, I'm using that word again, apostatized forms of definite social relations. And that overcoming, as it were, the economic categories means overcoming the very social relations that manifest themselves in that mode of appearance, in the form of seemingly independent economic categories, in a seemingly independent economic objectivity, in the form of an economic objectivity that seems to have its own logic beyond the control of the individuals and of society at large. The latter method, social critique, is sometimes referred to as an ad hominem critique, which means an attempt to decipher the human basis of these apostatized, seemingly independent, seemingly unfolding, but their own economic logic. But ad hominem does not mean humanizing. To find the human basis does not mean to humanize the economic categories. It also does not mean to moralize the economic categories or their effects on human beings with the claim that this effect ought to be different. It does also not mean to return the economic object to man with a capital M, Mensch, as its a sort of anthropological essence. It doesn't mean that. Because in either of those cases, we would not consider the actual living, existing relations, social relations. We would naturalize, again, the human basis by now talking about a human natural foundation, or we're talking about an anthropological essence that somehow seems to be unchanging throughout history. The quotation rejects that too. Ad hominem means to dig into the economic categories. Ad hominem means to decipher their origin in historically specific social relations. It means to conceptualize them as inverted forms of human social practice. However verrückt or perverted this practice might be in the form of an independent dynamic of the economic object. an economic object that seems to unfold as if it really were, and is indeed, a person apart. And I will look at that in more detail once I get going in terms of the forms of critique, the forms of ad hominem critique. But first, let me try to, in inverted commas, define ad hominem critique. Ad hominem means that human social relations are not to be derived from hypothesized economic structures or from hypothesized economic presuppositions or from hypothesized economic categories. Instead, it is these structures, these categories, these presuppositions that need to be understood as the objective forms of historically definite human social relations. I'm still with the quotation, trying to unpack it, trying to find out what it says. So, for the critical tradition, dialectics means to open concepts, to open categories. Dialectics in the critical tradition means to focus on social contents. And it does so by moving within or in and through their social forms. So here, dialectics is not about society. It's not about the economy. It is rather conceptual digging into the economic categories, into society. It is tasked with subverting the economic categories by revealing their basis in historically specific social relations. So I've already defined society. Its shape remains human. Its shape is not humane. Its shape remains human. So in that sense, and I got a couple of more quotations from Marx, capital is not an economic thing. Capital is rather a definite social relationship, belonging to a definite historical formation of society, which is manifested in a thing and lends this thing a specific social character. So capital is not something to do with the economy. It is a social relation that manifests itself and appears as an economic thing. That's from Capital, Volume 3. So further, capital, he says, is self-valorizing value. And self-valorizing value, money in process, value in process, and as such, capital is an abstraction in action. But, he says, it comprises class relationships. It is founded on the social character of labor. And that is the characteristic of labor as wage labor. That is its historical foundation. So that's from Volume 2 of Capital. So let's forget this for a moment. And let's look now as to what this quotation is in fact criticizing. And within the Marxist tradition, it rejects the quotation in my way of trying to expound it. It critiques a critique of capitalism from the standpoint of labor, or a critique of capitalism from the standpoint of the working class. In this critique, what is presupposed is the category labor as an historically or transhistorically active, a transhistorically conceived category of our metabolism with nature. What is presupposed here is the idea of labor as the source of wealth in every society. And I suppose that conception of labor very much derives from chapter 1 of The Wealth of Nations of Adam Smith, where he says, the wealth of society is productive labor. And the wealth of society as productive labor, he says, develops through the ever-increasing productivity of labor, which develops as a consequence in an ever greater, ever increased division of labor, which leads ultimately through various stages of history to what he considers as commercial society, which is a society which entails a social division between the classes, but also a division between the institutions, between state, society, and economy, as seemingly separate institutions, which is the consequence, he says, of labor as the principle of wealth throughout history. But for the Marxist, for the traditional Marxist critique, what is here rejected is the capitalist mode of labor. What is rejected is capitalism as an exploitative, crisis-prone system of labor for private gain. And the demand is the emancipation of labor from capitalist domination in socialism. Its argument for socialism is founded on a theory of the history of modes of productions as historically specific organization forms of labor economy. According to this view, labor, as it were, has two different categories. The first one is, in any society, human beings productively expend their corporeal powers. In other words, in order to exist, we have to eat. In order to eat, we have to expend our labor. And the critique, as it were, of the political economy of capital has therefore to differentiate between the generic materiality of human life, the generic materiality of labor, as the transhistorical presupposition of the modes of production on the one, and on the other, the specific capitalist form of wealth. And I guess this argument for us seems really familiar. In order to eat, we have to exchange with nature, and in capitalism, that exchange with nature appears in a specific historical form. May I invite you back to read the quotation? We are no longer developing the forms of capitalist labor from the actual living or existing relations. We now do the opposite, which this quotation rejects as uncritical. We come to a concept of a transhistorical generic activity. And we judge the capitalist mode of production as historically specific. And from that, as it were, derives the demand for a different mode of production, where this, as it were, generic corporeal expenditure of our labor is organized rationally, without exploitation, by means of central planning. So in this approach that is rejected by Marx, labor economy, which is the generic power of labor, the human metabolism with nature, appears as a transhistorical, as an objective transhistorical categories. And out of that comes our notion of modes of production and historical changes and historical evolution towards commercial society, as far as Adam Smith was concerned, towards capitalist society. And why should it stop? There is still a step or two to go towards communist society. It rejects the capitalist modality of this generic necessity as irrational, crisis-driven, exploitative, and it demands a modality, it's called socialism, where labor is organized rationally, where exploitation ceases, where private property ceases, and where labor is expended for the sake of society as a whole, particularly, I suppose, for those who do the actual laboring. So socialism here is seen, as it were, as a mode of production for the working class. Of course, the working class still has to work. It just now does it in a way that is benefiting itself as well. So, what is presupposed here is the category of labor as an ontological foundation of all social wealth. Labor produces wealth. And the critique here of capitalism does not amount to a critique of labor economy. It only amounts to a critique of the capitalist organization of labor economy. It projects a different organization of labor economy. So this critique, this traditional critique, is quite programmatic. It knows what needs to be done, namely the capitalist organization of labor economy needs to be changed into a socialist version of labor economy. But labor economy is treated as a transhistorical, objective necessity. It is ontologized. And I argue, on the basis of that quotation, that the standpoint of capitalism, or that the critique of capitalism from the standpoint of labor, perverts the critical intentions of Marxist historical materialism. I call the quotation. It is, in reality, much easier to discover by analysis the earthly core of our metabolism with nature through labor as generic activity than to do the opposite, and that is develop from the actual given relations of life, the forms in which they have become apotheosized. And these are the forms of wealth, the forms of labor, the forms of state, the forms of law, even the form of humanity, which is a form of humanity in which business comes first and human warmth necessarily second. So, in this traditional way of thinking, it is about history. It's about history to identify transhistorical objective laws of development. It is not in and through society to decipher the specific, historically specific social relations that manifest themselves in the form of natural economic categories. It is not the critique of the economic categories in and through society or in and through the actual existing social relations. Critique in and through the actual social relations says that the economic categories manifest an inverted form of sociability. If we look at the categories of price, profit, cash, market forces, the economy, what do we identify? What is their constitution? Is their constitution economic? What is an economic constitution as opposed to a social constitution? If you ever raise the question of the social constitution of the economic categories, we deny them their economic characteristic. We say, in fact, that the non-conceptual society in a mode of being denied, that the non-conceptual content, or that the economic categories have a non-conceptual content, that the non-conceptual content of the economic categories are historically specific social relations. We do not see these relations, do we, in the economic categories? What we see is market forces. What we feel is the invisible hand when it slaps you down. What we know is the struggle for access to crude and material things. In all of that, we perceive the economy as a natural force, as something beyond control, as market forces, not as social forces. And the critique says that in fact the economic forces, or the content of the economic forces, is something non-conceptual, something that they do not show, something that they deny. The critique says it is the actual social relations that manifest themselves as economic forces, as independent economic forces, as uncontrollable economic forces, as economic forces that seem to have a logic, a behavior, a mode of existence of their own, and frame social life, where each one is a price taker, where each one is governed by the price mechanism. That is not untrue. But what manifests itself in the price mechanism, what manifests itself in the invisible hand, something economic whose nature cannot be determined other than by presupposing the economic as a self-constituting thing throughout history, or what manifests itself in the economic forces are the actual relations of life that appear in a mode of being denied as the non-conceptual content of these forces. So let me return briefly. What kind of critique is required? A constructive critique, which wishes to make these economic forces behave differently, confirming, as it were, their economic constitution, though we cannot say where that constitution comes from, or a moralizing critique, which says it is as it is, it ought to be better, and is our ought there not also an ought that is conceived as transhistorically, freedom and equality, or is it negative? Negative in the far as here are the economic categories, and the critique here is a critique of the entire system of the economic categories. A critique of the entire system of the economic categories as a system whose content, whose substance is their non-conceptual content, namely social relations of productions that manifest themselves in apotheosized forms, in forms that appear godlike, in forms that appear natural, in forms that appear transhistorically objective and active. So it demands a critique that does not reject the capitalist economy or categories abstractly or as imperfect. Instead, it requires a critique that recognizes the economic categories as the categories that are the product of certain historically specific social relations. It's an argument which says economic nature is a social nature, insofar as it belongs to definite social relations. Relations that manifest themselves in the inverted form of the economic subject. All social life is essentially practical. All mysteries that lead theory to mysticism find their rational solution in human praxis and in the comprehension of this practice. Money, it's just a piece of metal, isn't it? A piece of paper, a piece of plastic, a number on the screen. Where does it get its power from? Does money care about inflation? Does money get depressed when its value falls? Is money unhappy when it crashes? Is money interested whether it's longed for by the poor and rich alike? Does money weep? Does money suffer? Is money bothered that it is the form of capitalist wealth? How do you struggle against money? I don't know. But we certainly struggle for money. Because we need money in our pockets. We need wage income, salaries, to make a living. The capitalist struggles for money too, to make a profit. And in fact, for the working class, a profit needs to be made, because that's the only guarantee of continuous employment, and thereby wage income, and therewith access to the means of subsistence. Everybody struggles for money, but it's very difficult to struggle against it. What do you oppose? So, money rules. Does money know that? Does it wake up in the morning, brushes its teeth, and shouts into the mirror to say, I'm ruling, I'm king? How does money rule? It rules because it's the universal form of capitalist wealth. And as such a universal, it has the power to splinter the particular, like a torture instrument. It is embodied in the human soul. Its coldness is a social coldness. We do what we do because we have to do it for business, for our own self-preservation, regardless of what we consider some to be morally object. Our social self-preservation, our individual preservation, entails that we make money in any way possible. If you don't get wage income, if you are unsalaried, if you have no independent means of existence, what would you do to keep yourself alive? How much does it cost to sell your kidney? How much does it cost to be a drug lord? What would you do? Money rules. But it does not rule because it is a universal or a transhistorical universal. It rules because it is the form of historically specific social relations. According to Marx, in his critique of political economy, he says I deal with the social individuals only as personifications of the economic categories, as personifications who struggle for money, to make a living. That is, the social relations, according to this code, assume the form of a relationship between economic things and are governed by the forms of their existence. They are governed by the economic things. And how do the social relations that assume the form of an economic thing and therefore disappear in the form of the economic thing, how do they appear in their disappearance? They appear in their disappearance as compelled personifications of their own economic world, as price takers, as people who struggle for profit, as people who exploit, as people who maim, as people who kill for money, and who work for money. So the world manifests itself behind the backs of the social individuals. A world that compels them, the people, the social relations, as rational actors who compete and struggle to ensure their self-preservation. Yet this compelling world that manifests itself behind the backs of the people is their own world. It is not the world of the economic subject as a subject of ontological independence. It is their own world. And it's the freedom of economic compulsion is a freedom that belongs to historically specific social relations. This is the end of my first part. The second part now, I look into approaches that try to, as it were, critique the economic categories in the way I have outlined. And this critique goes under the name of social form critique or social form analysis. It's a critique that developed post-1968 in inverted commas, Western Marxism, the States, West Germany, and Britain in particular. So social form critique or social form analysis is about the social constitution of the economic categories, according to this quotation. So it expounds the nature of the economic categories as a social nature. Social form analysis thus looks at, considers the forces of production as well as our normative categories as specific forms and manifestations of historically definite social relations. Moshe Postone, or the late Moshe Postone, summarized this contrast between the traditional conception and social form critique quite well in the following quotation. And in order to get it out right, I let him drink. Marx's critique, he says, transforms the categories of political economy from transhistorical categories of the constitution of wealth, which is what Adam Smith does. This was what traditional Marxism did, still does. He transforms them, the economic categories, into critical categories of the specificity of the forms of wealth and social relations in capitalism. The social form approach comes in three overlapping but distinct forms or guises. It's immanent critique, it's systematic dialectics, and it is the critique of the economic categories as inverted social categories, which is the decipherment of the economic abstractions as the hypothesized forms of definite social relations. I will go through these distinct forms one by one. As I said, they are overlapping. I treat them as distinct in order to show their jurisdiction, as it were. I will offer short critiques of immanent critique and systematic dialectics, but not of the third one, which is the decipherment of the economic world as an inverted social world, because that includes the best aspects of the previous two. So, immanent critique. Immanent critique judges reality by the standard of its own claims. For example, it judges the reality of social equality by the standard of its normative claims to equality. By judging reality according to its own criteria, it seeks to make, and I quote, the petrified relations dance by singing their own tune to them. That is Marx from the Holy Family. So this critique then does not criticize reality as failing to live up to its normative standard. Instead, it tries to both demystify the normative idea of, say, freedom and equality as the pleasant norms of a dreadful social content, a content of human suffering, a content of exploitation, a content of domination, and, in addition, it retains a glimpse of what could be. So, the liberal idea, or the liberal category of freedom, purports to yield the utopian image of a genuinely free individual. But on closer inspection, it depicts an individual released from feudal social structures who is granted the autonomy that the capitalist economy requires of him or her, which is a mockery of freedom, which compels of true freedom, which compels the individual towards ruggedness, towards coldness. At the same time, it criticizes society for failing to fulfill its own conceptual standards, freedom. And it cannot advocate, or it cannot avoid advocating this standard. And therefore, it leads to demands for their social realization, for the social realization of its pleasant normative standards. So immanent critique here interrogates the social coldness of the normative standard and seeks, as it were, to move it forward, to give a glimpse of what could be. But immanent critique, it's my critique now, has become a traditional normative critique. It's argued that bourgeois society, that capitalist society, contains the promise of something better, or something more perfect, that it contains the promise of true freedom, true equality. So the critique of social coldness has to be more, I say, than just a normative argument about redistributive justice, about equality, and about freedom. Theoretical concepts and normative values cannot be perceived without reference to the historical elements implicit in them. The history-making violence which divorces the direct producers from the means of subsistence imbues the bourgeois concept of freedom and equality with a definite social content. This content appears in a civilized form of equivalent exchange relationships, in the form or a civilized form of contractual relationships between supposedly equal legal subjects. One trading her labor power for a wage to dodge the freedom to starve. The other consuming the acquired labor power for profit to avoid competitive erosion by enriching himself through the labor of a dispossessed class of surplus value producers. The concepts of justice, humanity, freedom, and equality do not comprise a normative standard that remains somehow separated from an altogether disagreeable social context. Rather, they are afflicted with the inhumanity and the injustice under whose spell they were conceived. The truth of normative critique is the untruth of freedom as economic compulsion. In reality, it really is the case, that the dynamic of the whole process of capital as a process of self-valorizing value is fed by the social practices of a class-divided society which owes its life, the individuals, to what is being done to them. In order for the free laborer to exist, he or she really needs to be exploited effectively. Bankrupt employers don't hire labor power, don't make labor contracts. They make labor redundant. So exploitation is done to the laborer. The laborer exists or owes their life to what is done to them. Only profitable employers hire labor power and make labor contracts. And as far as the normative critique is concerned, clearly, the civilized regulation of social coldness, of exploitation and domination, is much preferable to its authoritarian conduct. Yet, by standing up for the free laborer, wishing him or her to live better, the normative critique of capitalism endorses a system that compels them in their acquired freedom. The acquired freedom as an economic resource that struggles to dodge starvation by contracting with an employer on the labour market. Second, systematic dialectics. Systematic dialectics associated in Britain with Chris Arthur and in West Germany, or the former West Germany, with the Neue Marx lecture, focuses on the categorical character of the capitalist political economy. The attempt is to understand the logic that holds sway in it, that holds sway in the economic categories, that holds sway in the economic relations. Systematic dialectics recognizes the economic forms as forms of real economic abstractions. So systematic dialectics, now Marx lecture, elaborates the systematicity of society as a process of real economic abstractions and expounds the categorical character of the categories of economic, or of the relations, of economic compulsion. The trouble with this is that systematic dialectics, or Neue Marx lecture, seeks to identify, and I want to say identify in bold, the logic that holds sway in capitalist society. As a consequence of its goal to identify the economic logic, it forgets that economic reality in which men live is not independent from them. That the logic is the logic of a non-conceptual content, namely the actual social relations that assume the form of an economic logic. So in the case then, it really is the case, a logic holds sway in capitalist political economy. It incorporates the individuals as its personification. However, its shape remains human. That is to say, the individuals live in social being, not in economic nature. And their social being has not been given to them by the nature of capitalist economy. Rather, society as process is the manifestation of their own objectively compelled social practice. So deciphering them, the capitalist relations, does not only entail the discovery of a logic that holds sway in reified society. It also entails something else. It entails the understanding of distorted social individuals. The question of deciphering is not what is reification? That's really about reification. The question is different. The question is, what is reified? Is economic nature the source of its own reification? Or is the question, what is reified? Does that not point towards the social relations? And if it points towards the social relations, then reification is really an epiphenomenon. What matters is what it does to people. What is reified? And what therefore appears in reification? And what does it do to people? So the answer to these questions, and I mentioned it already, entails the discovery of the simple fact that capitalist reification cannot exist without distorting man with a capital M. The social relations are not just cogs in a system of economic compulsion, are not just economic resources in a reified economic society. As such cogs, mere human resources, mere instruments of production. They are possessed with consciousness and thought, and they suffer from the pressures of their reified existence, and they suffer as personifications of the economic categories. Society as a process of real abstraction does not suffer from the capitalist economic nature. Society as a process of real abstraction does not struggle. It does not go on strike. Money, as I mentioned to you earlier, is not interested in anything. It has no interests. It does not suffer from inflation or from depression. The economic categories, society as a reified process, does not go on strike, does not struggle to make ends meet. The social individuals struggle to make ends meet, and they do so as personifications of their own social reality. Their attempt at self-preservation manifests itself in the dynamic of the economic object. The world manifests itself behind their backs, yet it is their work. Or as I mentioned earlier, the working class depends on what is done to it. Working class struggle against exploitation is at the same time a struggle for exploitation, for employment, for wages, for access to the means of subsistence through wage-based employment. That is, the understanding of the mysterious character of the economic things, which abound with metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties, rests on the comprehension of the human social practice that furnishes them with a will and a dynamic. The social individuals, I quote, do this without being aware of it, and they do that in pursuit of their own self-preservation for access to the means of life. So although society's laws of motions abstract from the individual subjects, degrading them to mere executors, mere partners in social wealth and social struggle, there would be nothing, no money, no market, no invisible hand, without individuals and their spontaneity. Reification, society as mere process, society as system, finds its limitation in reified man with a capital M. So the critique of reified society amounts to a conceptualized praxis of the concept of the capitalist social relations. And now I come to my last bit. The preponderance of society as reified object entails at its non-conceptual content the sheer unrest of life as its hidden non-conceptual secret. Therefore, for a critical theory of the economic object, there is a need to make suffering speak, to lend a voice to suffering as the condition of all truth. In this context, suffering is not an existential term of pure subjective feeling. It is an objectively mediated term. It is the weight of objectivity upon the subject. And because that which the subject experiences in its most subjective moment, hurt, suffering, is objectively mediated. A definite logic holds sway in the social forms. The critique of political economy is decipherment of the social relations that constitute them. It is decipherment of the social relations of economic compulsion as relations of the sheer unrest of life. I mentioned earlier that in traditional Marxism, which considers the economic categories as categories that are historically overdetermined, transhistorical, generic forces, the political consequence of its understanding is quite straightforward because it's programmatic. It's already entailed in its conception of the economic categories as categories of nature. It entails, as it were, the understanding or the demand for their rational organization by means of state, by means of a central plan. For the critical tradition, that is quite impossible, because it is critique of the economic categories as categories of historically specific, actual, existing social relations. It argues that the struggle against suffering belongs to the system of bourgeois society. It argues that the class struggle is not something heroic. It is something very mundane. It is the daily experience struggle to make ends meet. It's not a struggle for the future. It is a struggle for existence in existing society. Whether or not the struggle against suffering turns also towards a struggle against the conditions that cause suffering is something that cannot in any way be predicted or anticipated. It might happen. It might not happen. And then history, as it were. It's not a history that has a telos, an aim. Then history remains a history of suffering in this or maybe a different constellation of domination and exploitation. So this is the end of this book. Just to add as a footnote, tomorrow I do the same again in relationship to the state as the political form of bourgeois society, looking again at Leninism and also social democracy as the two criticized forms of Marxist thought, and developing these forms through an understanding of a more expanded understanding of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith's conception of political economy, and then the critical theory, form critique, now expanded or explored in relationship to the state as the political form of bourgeois society. That's tomorrow. And on Wednesday I do the same again, this time in relationship to law, to legal form, and I do that as a homage, as it were, to Evgeny Pashukanis, whose book about legal form was published first in 1924, so it's a centenary of its publication. And Pashukanis was a Bolshevik, but he had something to say about legal form, which ultimately cost him his life. He was killed, if I remember it rightly, in 1937. And I will talk a bit on Wednesday about his conception of of law as a legal form that belongs to definite social relations, akin to this conception of Marx. And I will go beyond Pashukanis because in my view he cannot answer his own question, and I will try to answer his question by expounding Marx's Capital chapters 6, 23 and 24, section 1. And that is that for my talk today.
Thank you very much. Yes.